So this is a ship. So the flag a ship flies is the country they're registered to. So a ship can actually fly any flag it wants to. Doesn't matter where their head office is, and it doesn't matter where their crew on board is. So why would a company choose to register a ship with one flag over another? The first answer to that question is...
I have a question.
Nope. Money.
Whoa!
Yes, Elizabeth.
What flag is that you're holding?
It's a Canadian flag, obviously. So besides money, it's also avoiding regulations. So which kind of also equals money as well. So these could be regulations related to labor, safety, or the environment. And when a company chooses to flag their vessel with a certain flag for this reason, these flags are called flags of convenience. And the three big flags are Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands. So those three countries represent around 40% of the world's registered ships. They're not really like big players on the world stage, but they're really big players on the shipping stage. So fortunately, it's not the only regulations that you have to meet are the regulations that you're flagged with, but also you need to follow the regulations of where they are. So our little Canadian ship goes along and they sail into the west coast of Australia, which I now realize is backwards because of the video. But anyway, they sail into Queensland and they have to meet the regulations of Canada, but they also have to meet the regulations of Australia. So it's also really good. To keep things fair and easier, most countries agree to have common international regulations. So things like you might have heard of like MARPOL, which stands for Marine Pollution, and SOLAS, which is the safety of lives at sea. So these regulations are created and agreed upon at the United Nations. So for shipping, this group is called the International Maritime Organization, or the IMO. So countries will sign or ratify these regulations, and then they'll put them into their own regulations so that they can regulate either their own ships, their own flag ships, or also ships that are coming to that country. And the two are kind of separate. So they'll have different regulations for their ships and different regulations for ships that come in. In Canada, this is done through the Canadian Shipping Act. So how do these regulations get created and agreed upon? So this all happens at the UN, and we've set up a wee little UN for you just to give you a mock idea of what is happening. So welcome to the UN. I don't know if you can all see it here. And we're just going to go through how decisions are discussed.
I propose that all marine vessels should carry maple syrup on board. Maple syrup? No, they should carry potatoes.
Ew, potatoes are gross. Oh, not this again.
So say they wanted to make a change, they would discuss like having maple syrup on board. They would discuss this, and the change would come into force once a certain number of countries have agreed to it. And it's not just a certain number, it's also that number has to represent a certain percentage of the world's fleet. So you can see why having 40% of the world's fleet tied up in 3 countries is could be problematic. It doesn't mean that it will necessarily be problematic, but it could be. So companies with ships with those flags of convenience could put pressure on those countries. Often those countries in particular, like Liberia, a lot of their income for that or their GDP from that country is dependent on shipping. So they could put a lot of pressure on that country not to sign certain regulations, or also get that country to sort of start pushing the IMO to make changes to those regulations that they're more comfortable with. Interestingly, one of the big debates going on right now is probably COVID, but before that, it was around greenhouse gases. So what vessels should be required to do and what standards should they have to meet? All of these things are going to cost a lot of money to an average vessel. So does anyone remember the top 3 flags of convenience? You can type it.
Panama.
Yay! Anyone else remember another one? Liberia. Yay, Nicole.
Marshall Islands.
Marshall Islands. Amazing. You guys have been listening. So an interesting fact about the Marshall Islands is their highest point above sea level is about 10 meters. So their highest elevation above sea level is 10 meters, which makes them particularly vulnerable to global warming, which in the whole scheme of the greenhouse gas debate is super interesting, because the Marshall Islands is driving really hard to make meaningful changes to the regulations. So at the moment, the requirements for greenhouse gases are super lax, like super, super lame. So one of them is that new vessels have to meet a certain energy efficiency. And back when we were looking at it for our vessels when I was at C-SPAN, all of our old vessels met those requirements. Vessels have to report on their greenhouse gases, so they just have to send them in, but they don't actually have to show that they're reducing their greenhouse gases in any way. And they also have to carry on board an energy efficiency management plan, which is actually just a tick box. Like no one actually looks at the management plan and no one makes sure that it's being implemented at all. So we're going to move on from that kerfuffle and pretend that the Marshall Islands has made some great headway and that they've gotten some great regulations in place and everyone's agreed to them. So they've said that they'll have some zero emission vessels by a certain time, or that vessels have to reduce their emissions by 90% by a certain time. So what kind of technologies will they be looking at? So I want to talk about 3. So the first one is batteries. So sorry, I'm reading the side comments. It's super distracting. The first one is Corvus, which is a Vancouver-based company, and they've got some of their batteries on ferries and tugs, and we're looking at them for our harbour patrol vessels. So they're really great for like those short sea sort of ships. I'm just going to ignore the comments on the side. It's really furiously writing here. The second one is wind. So we could go back to something like sails.
Back to the good old days.
More things like rotor sails. Wind is unfortunately a little unreliable, and for safety reasons, you can't factor the power that you get from wind into the minimum power requirements. And then the one that's kind of the golden child right now, and the one that we might see in the future, is something like hydrogen. And as long as this hydrogen is made from a green source, then it's something that we could see in the future. So yeah, that's international shipping in, I think, about 5 minutes. Tried to speed through it quickly, but yeah, spotlight off me. Woo! Over to you, James.
Well done, Meegs and family there. That was fantastic. I have a quick question. How did you get my uncle to play the role of the Irish UN representative there in your presentation? I was so surprised to see him, like, you know.
The eyes, right?
Yeah. So does anyone have any questions for me?
Where are the Marshall Islands?
Yeah, the Marshall Islands. Yeah, the Marshall Islands are they're in the Pacific Ocean, so they're like Northern Pacific, I think. Super small, like super tiny. I think there's like 50,000 people that live there. It's like such a tiny little country, and it has like 15% of the world ships registered with it. I think it's like a ship per person. Anyway.
When are you going to get promoted to be in charge of all of this?
Were the stuffed animals, were they sized according to the percentage of fleet?
No, they were sized according to personality, actually. I mean, they were, no, just personality. Yeah, they were matched with the country based on personality and just general feel, the vibe. Yeah.
Has it always been these 3 countries?
Sorry?
Has it always been those 3 countries? Or do they change often enough-ish, or is it pretty consistently them?
It's pretty consistently them. So they're the 3 that are they're the 3 that have been the big 3 for a while. Yeah, it's like to flag a vessel with like the States, say, and the States is kind of a bad one because they require any cargo goods moved between the States to be with a US flagged ship, but the States have some really hefty environmental regulations that a ship has to meet, so a lot of they won't flag if they don't have to.
What's the incentive for a country to be one of those big 3? Like, how much money do they make?
They make a lot of money. So I think the Marshall Islands, it's one of their biggest resources for money is through shipping and having so many ships flagged with them. The ships have to pay an amount to them, but they're not. It's not necessarily. Yeah, they'll pay less than say if they're flagged with Canada. Or...
That's okay.
Yeah.
I got another question for you.
Yeah.
You were saying there's like a different set of rules for flagged ships versus ships that come into the water.
Yeah.
Which ones tend to be stricter?
So definitely a country will have stricter regulations for, well, it depends. It depends on the regulation and it depends on the thing. So like if it's, say it's MARPOL and we're looking at oil pollution, say, one of the requirements for oil pollution is that you have to like meet certain discharge standards. And that won't change like amongst vessels that, it won't change much between countries and it won't change between vessels that are visiting or vessels that are flagged with that country. But some of the other ones like safety and crew requirements might change. So things like hours at rest and things like that could change. Like a country might, like Canada probably has stricter labor laws just in general than a country like the Philippines, which wouldn't have a stricter, or safety. Yeah.
If Marshall Islands are kind of like the ones fighting for the positive change in terms of emissions, who is fighting against them? Like, who's the main like anti?
For a while it was, I haven't really followed the what's happening at the IMO for the last lot of rounds. Most of them are in it. The BRIC countries aren't, so Brazil, South Africa, Iran generally is against it. US, not great. Australia, not that great either. Yeah, so it just is, it's yeah. There is a few countries that are like pro it and are trying to get things going. A lot of them, like a lot of the stuff is often delayed. They don't want to put their necks out and piss off their ships, essentially.
Where does Canada stand on it?
Where does what, sorry?
Where does Canada stand on it?
Canada doesn't have much of a voice at the IMO. It does, actually, that's a lie. It does around underwater noise. It has like a really big voice and a really important voice. For greenhouse gases, I don't actually know where Canada stands on it. But as far as like ships flagged with Canada, there's not a lot. We've got a lot of like domestic ships, but we don't have a lot of international ships.
So Megan, for all these ships that register or like raise the flag of the top two countries that you mentioned, is there a cap? Like, is there like a maximum number of ships that can fly these flags?
No. And like, so it's a big company, like a big container company like Maersk, who has, I think, 500 ships. They'll have some of their vessels flagged with, in their Danish flag, which is where their company's based. And then they'll have some in Liberia and some in Marshall Islands. Like they'll split their fleet up depending on where that ship's going and what it's carrying and a bunch of other reasons. But yeah, there's a lot of dodgy stuff that happens. One of my least favorite ones is you can have a fleet. Say I own a fleet of 10 vessels. I can actually make each vessel a company. And so if one of them goes down, the other 9 are kind of like safe from that one going down. Like say that one has a big oil spill and is like causes all this environmental damage, then the rest of them are still okay. Like they don't have to pay for that one. Like you can kind of like bankrupt that ship kind of thing, which is like the shittest thing.
One of my best friends in high school, her dad worked for OOCL, and all I remember is that he's filthy rich.
Yeah. It's like big money, and it's big old money, and like I call it old white men. There's so many times I'm just in like a room full of old white men. It's changing. It's slowly changing, but it's pretty old money, and it's pretty like ships they're not like, even though Vancouver is considered a port city, we're not. It's not something that is in people's like day-to-day like thoughts and like they're out in the ocean and they're not like in front of your face. Like they're not the same as say stuff that you see like TransLink or anything like that, which is so much more.
There are like 20 of them in English Bay.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Point. Yeah.
How many
Yeah, but
ships?
it's kind of weird. People like people seem they're kind of like they're so background. People are like, oh yeah, that's nice. It's the tankers. Like the people kind of like them.
Yeah, and they are like the ones that are in English Bay are all bulk carriers, and bulk carriers in Canada generally are carrying grain or potash. So they're pretty innocuous vessels, but they're the tankers are in and out. Like the tankers can't loiter in Canada, in like English Bay. You'd never see a tanker there. Things have gone horribly if you see a tanker there.
How many total international like are there?
Sorry?
How many ships are there international?
I can't hear you.
How many ships are there? Like total?
How many ships?
Yeah, like
I think 70,000.
Yeah.
Last count, maybe. Maybe that's off by a factor of 10. No one's fact checking this, are they? Is anyone fact checking this?
Well, did you learn nothing? They're called vessels.
Ships are vessels. I call them boats if I'm pissed off with them. Don't call them boats. People get
You
mad.
can tell everyone what a ro-ro is.
Oh yeah, ro-ros, which is great because Tyke's kid called Roro. A Roro is like a car carrier because they roll the cars on and then they roll them off again. Roro, so cute. I'm still looking for a bath toy for them that's a Roro.
In the UK, that used to be called roll on, roll over. We had a few disasters with those boats, but they didn't close the doors properly.
Yeah, there's many disasters. I could do another talk on like shipping disasters. It's funny, a lot of the environmental regulations, so SOLAS, which is the safety of life at sea, one of the big requirements for that is that you have to match the number of passengers with the number of life jackets and the number of lifeboats spots on a vessel.
Seems ridiculous.
Yeah, it seems ridiculous. It was put into place after the Titanic sank and that there was not enough like of any of those things on the Titanic, and so they were like, oh, we should amend that, and so they put in SOLAS. And then a lot of the oil stuff happened after major oil disasters. So there was a couple of really big oil disasters and things like double tanks. So rather than having like the oil just carried in a single-sided hull, and then if that hull gets punctured, then the oil just leaks out. They now have to have double. So they have to have an air gap space in between, so the first hull can act as like there's like a little bit of a secondary sort of protection. And that happened after a bunch of vessels like ran aground and like hit rocks and spilled oil everywhere. And the industry was like, oh shit, we should fix this. So, yeah.
In the Titanic's defense, it was unsinkable.
They should have had no life rafts.
It was made of iron.